Hello, everyone. Hopefully, there looks like there's about 150 of you um, in the session now. We'll just give it a minute before we get started, but thank you for joining us all tonight um, for another Birds Meet webinar. This time talking about quite a sad topic, I will admit, but one that I hope that you find very interesting and come away with some actions that you all can undertake as well as we talk about the impact of rat poisons on our native birds and other taxa and what BirdLife is going to be doing and is doing about it. We'll just give it a couple of minutes and then we will get started. But you can familiarise yourselves with the Q&A function that we have in this Teams session. So along the top of your screen, you should see a few buttons. The Q&A section is where you can ask questions and we will get to some of those questions at the end of the night. There's also a chat function, but I don't think everybody can see that. So if we can add our questions to the Q&A, that would be great. And I think we might just get started. Looks like we've got a couple of hundred people joined and others will come along the ride. We are recording the session tonight, so for anybody who has to drop out, don't worry, we will make this available to you after the event. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight during Bird Week. My name's Holly Parsons. I'm the manager of priority sites for BirdLife Australia. I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that everybody is dialing in on tonight. I'm calling in from Dharawal country, so I'm on the south coast of New South Wales. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that to any Indigenous people who are joining us tonight. Well, as I said at the start, we are talking about the impact of rat poisons on our amazing Australian bird life, particularly on our birds of prey. Tonight, you're going to hear a little bit about what those particular poisons are, how they work, and what we can do about them in the current environment. I'm going to talk to you a little bit later tonight, but first up, we're going to hear from Dr. Mike Lohr. So I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Mike. I might toggle him up on the screen now. Let's see how this goes. There we go. There he is.
Hello.
Hi, Mike. So Mike is an independent environmental consultant. He is a wildlife ecologist and he's an adjunct lecturer at Edith Cowan University. Before he moved to Australia about 13 years ago, so you'll hear the accent, Mike specialised in the control of introduced plants and animals to conserve native wildlife in Hawaii. Mike's research has focused mainly on bird ecology, which is part of the reason we have him here tonight, but he also has covered a wide range of topics, including invasive plant distributions, genetics, improving control of introduced mammals, and a whole host of other things. For the last, Mike tells me, 5,710 years, he has focused his attention on the impacts of rodent poisons on native wildlife in Australia. And it's Mike's research that really started some of this work for me as well. I remember seeing Mike present his some of the research that he'll talk to you about tonight way back in about 2017. So I'm thrilled to have Mike here tonight to tell us all about rat poisons and how they're impacting our Australian wildlife. And just quickly, we also have BirdLife's nature campaigner, Tarquin Moon. She'll be joining us as well a little bit later with the Q&As. But I think for now, I'm going to hand over to Mike and I'm going to pop out. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the wonderful introduction there. And yeah, as Holly said, I'll be going over a bit of the kind of the history of some of the research surrounding this issue and how it affects birds, but how it also affects some other taxa and how that in turn, because in ecology everything is related, how that actually affects birds yet again. And to start, I just wanted to, I guess, go through some of the basics around what an anticoagulant rodenticide is and how they work exactly, because it's important to understand that when you're understanding exactly how they're causing problems for a lot of our native wildlife. So the way that they basically work is by blocking the recycling of vitamin K in the liver. Vitamin K is needed to synthesize a bunch of different clotting factors, and essentially when you run out of it and your recycling of it is blocked, you're no longer able to synthesize those clotting factors, and and you potentially bleed out either internally or externally. And they can be broadly categorized into two different groups: the first generation and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. The first generation ones, they were mostly developed in the 1940s through the 1960s. You might be familiar with warfarin or Coumadin. We actually use that therapeutically with humans. It's one of that class of first generation anticoagulants. These ones, they break down relatively quickly. They're removed from the liver like within, within weeks, effectively. So like warfarin, for example, has a half-life of about 16 days. So it takes 16 days to get rid of half of it, and then there's 16 to get rid of half of that. And in order to kill, rats and mice, they require the rats and mice to come back and feed on them multiple nights in a row. Because the brilliance of the way that they work is that they're actually quite a slow poison. So by the time the rodent has gotten a full lethal dose, they're not actually feeling bad at all, because it takes about 5 to 8 days between once they've received a lethal dose and had all of the vitamin K recycling blocked in their liver, in order for them to run out of the reservoirs of vitamin K that are still in their body. But what's happened over time is that some rodents have developed resistance to these first generation products. And as a consequence, in the 1970s and 1980s, they started to develop the second generation anticoagulants based on a similar chemical structure. They operate relatively similarly. But again, in the 1950s, you started seeing resistance developing in brown rats in the UK. And so they came up with these second generation products. These ones are much stronger, and importantly, they're much more persistent in liver tissue. So instead of like a 16-day half-life in warfarin, one of the stronger second generation compounds called birdificum, you're looking at a half-life out past 300 days. So it's really going to sit there for a long period of time and continue to do its work. It's also much, much stronger. So when the rodents eat some of it on that first night, where normally with first generation products, it would take, 5 or so nights of that rodent coming back and eating, more and more warfarin in order to get a lethal dose. It gets a lethal dose on the first night, but it still has 5 to 8 days worth of vitamin K in the system to keep running. So every night it can come back and eat another more than lethal dose. And as a consequence, you've got sort of this Walking Dead conundrum where this rat, which is going to die, is coming back and able to eat more and more and more, and then potentially pass that up the food chain as it starts to slow down and function less well, and potentially move a lot more during the day, which is one of the impacts that these rodenticides can have. So this leads to some unpleasant impacts on your native wildlife. So you can have just direct on-target deaths from exposure, so from both primary and secondary exposure. So things getting into the boxes, eating the bait directly, obviously that's a problem. But there's also secondary and in some instances tertiary exposure. So we're talking about animals that are eating, dead and dying rodents or other non-target things that have directly eaten bait, and then sending it up the food chain as it goes. And you do see in some instances where they've done research overseas, animals that are far removed from areas around people's houses and areas where people are baiting for rodents, such as mountain lions, directly dead in remote areas with 5 different types of anticoagulant rodenticides detectable in the liver. So a lot of the research that we've been working on here in Australia is trying to understand the secondary exposure in a lot of the non-target wildlife. But the direct mortality and direct lethal poisoning isn't necessarily the only negative impacts that second generation anticoagulants can have. You also see a fair amount of bleeding and bruising, so sublethal hemorrhages. And this can lead to, the animals having more difficulty moving, generally slowing down, and can lead them to be more susceptible to other sources of mortality. So increased risks of predation or accidents, getting hit by cars, birds flying into windows, things of that nature. There's also some pretty unpleasant immunological issues around rodenticide exposure. In some species, it's been demonstrated that some parts of the immune system are suppressed by exposure to second generation products, and some parts of the immune system are actually ramped up to the point that they actually burn out and become non-functional. And this has actually been seen to cause issues with increased parasitism in some species, though the mechanism is not entirely clear. They're not clear on whether it's because of immunosuppression, making it easier for the parasites to, attack the host animal, or whether it's simply easier to suck blood out of a host that happens to be on blood thinners. We're not entirely sure on that yet, but either one's a possibility. But one example that we've seen in California in the United States, just outside of San Diego in the hills there was a big collapse in the bobcat population, and it was associated with an infestation of mange. And the severity of mange in the animals that had died actually correlated with exposure to second generation anticoagulants. So worth considering some of these impacts outside of the traditional just lethal poisoning. One of the other impacts that I do want to mention, and I make a point of doing this in every presentation that I do, is island eradications. And it's a particularly important one for a lot of our native seabirds. In cases where rodents have been introduced on islands, especially islands with seabirds, they do massive ecological damage. And your second generation anticoagulants are one of the few effective tools that we have for controlling rodents under those situations and completely eradicating them. Full disclosure, I've done this, multiple times on islands throughout the Pacific as part of the work that I used to do back in the day. And in these instances, these chemicals are used responsibly. They're used in a way that accounts for, potential damage to native populations. Every effort is made to ensure that, any impacts are minimized there. And generally what you see is, even if there is some degree of collateral damage, unlike in urban settings where the stuff is being drip fed into the system constantly, it's one pulse, the rodents are completely removed, and then they're never used again. And populations of native species tend to recover incredibly because the rats hammer the ecosystem at every trophic level simultaneously. So I do want to make a point to say these are actually useful in some circumstances, and that one particularly. So when I first arrived in Australia, I was a bit surprised. Starting in around 2008, actually under the George W. Bush administration, the U.S. put in some really strict restrictions, largely based on impacts on kids and pets, on your second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So they're only allowed to be used by licensed pesticide applicators who have to keep fastidious records of when and where they're deployed. I had permits to do it as part of my work on island eradications. It took me approximately, it was about 2 weeks of classes followed by 2 days worth of testing in order to get a license to be able to get a permit, to be able to apply for a permit to use these things. They can only be used in indoor areas aside from special exemptions for conservation use. And they all have to be in lockable bait boxes to protect kids and pets. And you're starting to see, so that subsequently spread to Canada, and the EU has relatively similar legislation. There's also a bit of a different regulatory framework in the UK, but again, they have much stricter laws than here. And you're even starting to see, countries like Malaysia and Singapore requiring access only by licensed pesticide applicators. And Malaysia has banned the sale of it at grocery stores on account of potential human health and safety issues from dust from the packages. On the contrary, Here in Australia, you can purchase 3 different first-generation anticoagulants and 5 different second-generation anticoagulants at pretty much any grocery store, hardware store, convenience store, servo, just about anywhere. No license is required. There are no reporting requirements on when and where these are deployed. There's no age restrictions. My kids can literally go down to Bunnings and buy as much as they want right now. And there's, no restrictions on how much can be purchased. So when I first saw this, coming from a very different system, I was a bit shocked, and it coincided with when I was starting my PhD. So I went and this is not just a cautionary tale about what happens when you spend too much time around a species and start to actually beginning to resemble your study species, but I first approached it by writing a review of any instances of rodenticide poisoning that had already been documented in native wildlife in Australia. And while I did find quite a few different species where there was anecdotal evidence or suspected poisoning, there weren't any studies that had directly tested native wildlife and looked at, how much and what kind of poison is being detected in a particular wildlife species in Australia. So given that I was studying booboks and some of the threats that were facing them, I included this as just one chapter, which kind of got away from me a bit, and just had a look at what was going on with rodenticides in booboks. So collecting dead birds and testing the livers to see, just get a baseline of what was potentially happening. I was not prepared for the results. They were actually the second highest exposure rates detected in any bird species worldwide up to that point, which was a bit of a surprise to me. If you look at that chart there, it's anything in the black is above the threshold of any species we know, any bird species surviving. The red is almost certainly going to be lethal as well. So you're talking about, out of the birds that I sampled, 18% of them almost certainly directly dead of rodenticide poisoning. And in total, half of the bird species being exposed at levels that are either definitely lethal or potentially lethal. Which, when you start to get to numbers like that, you really do need to start to be concerned about population level impacts. And there has been some modeling with other species that have lower exposure rates, other species of owls and raptors in the United States and Canada, that suggest population level impacts at substantially lower levels than what were detected in the booboks in this study. So this research, while it was interesting in and of itself, I think, and tells a bit of a story there, it touched off a bit of an avalanche of other studies. And I hate this gigantic, ugly wall of text. I don't like to make slides like this, but I think it serves to demonstrate a point in that there's been an overwhelming amount of evidence showing really serious exposure across all different sorts of species across Australia. And I just wanted to walk through some of the more, some of them that help to kind of unpick the story. I don't have time to go through all of them, but just touching on the ones in green today, to give an example of, sort of what's going on broadly in Australia and how it all works. And the first one I wanted to look at is, after the booboks, I was curious about whether other raptor species, predatory birds, were potentially being impacted. So I worked with a whole suite of people across the country to get samples analyzed from a bunch of different raptor species, just whatever we could get our hands on, really. And 70% of the individuals ultimately came back as being exposed, representing 10 different additional raptor species, including some surprising ones that you wouldn't expect to see, things like white-bellied sea eagles, where not species that are typically going to be associated directly with eating rats and mice. So, it really points to some pretty substantial exposure across the food chain. And in addition to that, there were a number of non-raptor species represented as well. So things like tawny frogmouth and ravens, magpies, things of that nature. So it really got me thinking about, okay, if a lot of your predatory birds are potentially badly impacted across Australia, what does this look like with some of our threatened predatory mammals? So I started the kind of bizarre process of asking people to send through threatened mammal livers from other states. The Department of Agriculture, when I asked for the permit, they're like, "What do you want this for?" I was like, "Ah, some really exotic pate." They didn't laugh as much as I did, but it was an interesting process. But nonetheless, what ended up falling out of this was we tested all four quoll species across the country, plus Tasmanian devils, um, and found substantial exposure in all species. The only species that we didn't detect lethal levels in, or higher than lethal levels in, was northern quoll, and that was because, again, you're dealing with endangered species here. There's not, and trying to get livers, there, not too many opportunities to do that. You take what you can get. And in that instance, we had a sample size of only three, and two were from extremely remote areas, like far, just, roadsides, far from any sort of human habitation. The only one that was, where it was within even, like, I think 10 kilometers of a town site, it did have some detectable exposure in it. So these are not species that can sustain a substantial amount of additional mortality from sources other than what's driving their decline. And some of the modeling that we did as part of this paper showed that the amount of mortality that's potentially happening from rodenticides is, enough to tip the balance between the population remaining stable and the population beginning to decline further. So again, not species that can handle additive mortality on top of what they're already facing. And this is the sort of issue that could be the straw that broke the camel's back. Interestingly enough, while we were working on some of this project, some questions started to come up around threatened bird species, and I was contacted about a Carnaby's cockatoo, which had been brought into care here in Perth. This particular individual showed some really strange signs. The wildlife carers were a bit concerned about it and ended up bringing it to the Perth Zoo, where it subsequently died despite treatment 2 days later. It was, bleeding from the beak. It was sneezing a fair amount of blood. It had really severe, like, bruising that could be seen just under the skin. And ultimately, when we tested the liver, it actually had high concentrations of there were two different second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and it was sitting right on that threshold of potentially lethal and definitely lethal, which raises some really strange questions. So these are not obviously an animal that you'd expect to be going around eating rats and mice around somebody's house. How was it poisoned? Is it somebody potentially, like, illegally spreading bait around their yard? Was it, I've heard some people tell me that they're actually a bit more carnivorous than you would expect, and they may be opportunistic about this sort of thing. And if there are dead and dying rats just kind of wandering around slowly during the day, they might actually have a go at one. And then the other potential option that I can think of is, they've got very strong and dexterous bills, and they're very smart, long-lived birds. Are they learning to open up the bait boxes? You can do it relatively quickly with a pocket knife. So, and they're a lot stronger than that. So potentially that, but realistically, again, this is a species that doesn't really, it can't sustain additional mortality from these other sources. It's already critically endangered, and losing any individual is a problem. So the degree to which rodenticide poisoning is a problem in this species is unclear, but even losing one bird, not great. And this, a lot of this, it got me thinking about how these rodenticides are being vectored through the system, how they're traveling through the system, and why it is that we're seeing such high rates in a lot of these animals that we're testing in Australia, even relative to other parts of the world. And that's why I set up a project to look at exposure in reptiles in kind of the Perth metro area. And we tested three different species, dugites, bobtails, and tiger snakes. And I was really not expecting to see exposure in all of them. I mean, the dugites, sure, yeah, the adults, they'll eat lots of mice. So I was expecting that. Bobtails, they're kind of little vacuum cleaners. They'll eat all sorts of different things on the ground. They're tenacious little omnivores, and dietary studies show them eating everything from strawberries and occasional rats and mice that they find in a nest through to dog turds and cigarette butts. Anything that's on the ground, they'll try it. So I wasn't surprised to see at least some rodenticide poisoning there. But the tiger snakes, which are mostly away from buildings and mostly going to be eating frogs down by the lake, they were generally exposed at low levels, but 45% of them had detectable levels of rodenticide in them, which points to probably pretty serious ecosystem-wide contamination. So whether that's from insects, cockroaches, and eating baits in the bait box, and then subsequently leaving and being eaten by the frogs that they're eating later on, I'm not really sure, but it does demonstrate that this is really traveling through the food chain and ending up in places that are unexpected. And one of the really concerning things is that reptiles are incredibly resistant to anticoagulant rodenticides. Some of the LD50 studies where they tried to find out how much it would take to kill a fence lizard in the United States, they couldn't actually come to a number because even at the highest doses, which milligrams per kilogram were about 3,000 times what would kill a human, they didn't have any animals die. So it's possible that part of the issue we're seeing in Australia is because we have such diverse reptile fauna. They may just be incredibly effective vectors for sending this up the food chain, not dying themselves, but getting eaten by other species that are much more vulnerable. And you'll see in the photo here, there was those bobtail heads are all from underneath a wedge-tailed eagle nest where they'd been fed to the chicks. And you can see there's an adult actually feeding one of the chicks a bobtail arm. So this is, again, potentially a really serious issue for a lot of our predatory wildlife that's consuming reptiles. One of the other things that I was trying to look at when I was trying to understand why it is that rodenticides are, again, seemingly even more of an issue in Australia than other parts of the world where they have been heavily restricted, is looking at rodenticide resistance. Like I said, it was first detected in the 50s in the UK. So we set up some projects to have a look at resistance in genetics of resistance in mice and rats across Australia. So we only tested mice in Perth and one little tiny island off the Kimberley. Didn't find any resistance there, so they can probably be controlled effectively using first generation anticoagulants, which are a good deal less dangerous. But in rats, it was interesting. We didn't find any resistance in brown rats or Norway rats. But black rats, there was a particular mutation in the gene that the VKRC1 gene. And that's the gene that's responsible for your rodenticide resistance. There was one mutation. It's known to cause resistance even to some of your second generation products elsewhere in the world. And it was detected in a bunch of major cities, so Sydney, Melbourne, and particularly Perth, throughout those metropolitan areas. So the fact that these rats are resistant in those areas means that they can potentially send a lot more of that rodenticide up the food chain, and it takes a lot more to kill them, and that the second generation products may not even be all that effective in some instances. Moving on from here, there's a number of other things that I really do want to look at to try to understand exactly how this problem is affecting wildlife and potentially us as well. I'm interested in looking at rodenticide exposure in commercial food. There's a number of food products that have tested positive for it overseas before the restrictions came in. And again, I mentioned the issues around rodenticide poisoning or rodenticides exposure in reptiles. Some of your reptile species like goannas are popular items for some indigenous communities throughout Australia. Your Gould's sand goanna is seen being cooked there. Yeah, I'm deeply concerned because they happily will eat rodents and have been observed eating rodents during rat eradications on the Montebello Islands, to the point that they were actually pooping out green dye from the bait without any apparent ill effect. So I'm concerned that they may be a dangerous vector to humans in that instance. I'd be interested to look at research in exposure in pets. That was one of the driving factors in what happened with substantial restrictions coming in other countries. Looking at the efficacy of bait boxes, spoiler alert, we've already done some work. It's not just rats and mice that go into them. You can see the tail of a brush-tailed phascogale, which is a protected species here in Western Australia, sticking out of that bait box. And just getting some baseline exposure data for a couple of indicator species that exist across the nation, so that we can, if we are lucky enough to get some restrictions in Australia, track how that actually affects the wildlife species throughout the country over time and evaluate the efficacy of any new rules that come in. And this I've just included because some people may want to screenshot this. There's always questions about, what should I be using and what should I not? I've tried to make it as simple as possible because it isn't actually, it can be a bit confusing. Your first generation ones there are cumatetrolil and warfarin. They tend not to move up the food chain, but they will be poisonous to anything that eats it directly. Poison is in fact poisonous. And there are some issues around resistance if you're dealing specifically with black rats as the species that you're trying to control. The second generation products are there in red: difenicum, bromediolone, brodifacoum, diphthiolone, flucumaphen. Don't use those ones. It can be difficult to find on the package, but if you see any of those words on there, that's potentially going to cause substantial secondary poisoning. These are the ones that we're worried about. There are a couple of non-anticoagulant options. They don't have issues with resistance, and because they have just a completely different mechanism of action. There's cholecalciferol, which is effectively a gigantic overdose of vitamin D. That one does not have an antidote, so be very careful when using around kids and pets. It is dangerous to anything that eats it directly, but it doesn't cause damage up the food chain because it's vitamin D. So at the lower concentrations, it's not an issue. There's also one that's marketed as Rat Sack Naturals, which is corn gluten meal and salt, which it effectively dehydrates the rats. So if they die in your roof, there's actually less of an issue because they don't smell as much. So that one's relatively safe. They actually had difficulty getting it registered as a poison because both of the active ingredients are also registered food products. So they're in your cheese curls and stuff. So you could probably, I don't recommend you do it, but it would probably be just about safe to eat directly. And then there's one that's recently been registered only in, I believe, 2023, called bromethalin. It is a neurotoxin. It kills by causing brain swelling. And that one we don't know as much about when it comes to ecotoxicology, but some of Maureen Murray's research out of the US and Canada seems to be indicating that it's starting to show up now in a lot of your predatory birds at levels that are quite dangerous. So it does seem to have at least some potential for bioaccumulation. So I would caution staying away from that one for the time being, at least until we have better research on that one. And yeah, with that, I'm happy to hand it back to you, Holly. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mike. Incredibly depressing, but really important. Thank you so much. I will follow up with what Mike's been talking about. Hopefully, can everybody see my screen? Mike, can I get a thumbs up? Can you see it? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to toggle you off now. There you go. And then hopefully you can all see my screen. So Mike's talked to you about how the rodenticide work, how widespread they are across so much of our Australian wildlife now. So what I wanted to do was take you through BirdLife Australia's campaign, what we've been doing about it, what we're asking the government to change, which is in line with what Mike was talking about earlier, and largely in line with what's happening in other parts of the world as well, and also talking about what you can do both in your own home and then in the wider community as well. So BirdLife's approach is really about connecting the dots between the science, the work that Mike's been driving, the policies that are going on, and the people on the ground like yourselves. Um, we're engaging directly with the APVMA. I'll talk to you about them in a minute, and other decision makers, feeding into policy submissions, and keeping on the pressure through various petitions and campaigns that we've got. And we'll share some links later for some of those petitions that you can sign and share out amongst your family and friends. We've also been working with others in the space, particularly, we've done some great work with the Australian Environmental Pest Managers Association. They have a procedure around the use of rodenticides. They're looking at providing more training for their members as well, because of course they have access to second generation rodenticides, but also things like the Colentra, which is the other one that Mike was talking about before. So looking for sort of wildlife safe solutions and best practice that they can put in place to protect wildlife. And then we work with academics as well, looking at the latest research that is coming out, and we're working towards putting in what's called a key threatening process nomination to the federal government, which basically says that, second generation rodenticides are a key problem for a whole host of species, and needs to be officially recognised. So that's a piece of work that we've got currently underway. Finally, we're connecting with community groups and the public as well. So there's a whole host of community groups on the ground in their local areas who are doing amazing work. Special things like Our Friendly Margaret Rivers is an amazing one. Working and campaigning to the public, but also to local councils as well. So there's a whole host of people working on this issue, and we're trying to share resources with them and amplify their voice wider as well. So onto the APVMA review. So if you haven't heard of the APVMA, that is the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicine Authority. They are a government department. They report to the Agriculture Minister. They basically decide what pest control products and veterinary medicines can be sold and who can use them and how they can be used. So they are currently reviewing anticoagulant rodenticides. This review has been underway for a number of years now. It's a very long process, but it can lead to national rules that basically we are hoping can ban public sales of these products and restrict their use to trained professionals. There are other mechanisms as well. So at the state level or local councils can add their own controls. But the APVMA really sets the benchmark for everyone. If they put restrictions in place, everybody has to follow. So we're aiming big to get some changes at that level, given that review is underway. And so that's why BirdLife's really focusing a lot of our advocacy there. It's a single national decision that can protect wildlife across the country. So as I said, it's a very long review process. So it's about a 5-year process, and we're coming to the pointy end now. So this is a really timely session. The initial decision coming from that review process is scheduled to come out in late October. So, in the next week. There's been a number of delays prior to this, though. So they've about 4 times now pushed back when they're going to be making this announcement. Interestingly, there was only today an article that came out in ABC where the APVMA indicated that they had about 1,700 submissions into that review process to work through. And as Mike indicated with that long list of research papers, there's been a lot of ongoing research coming through as well during that process that they need to consider. So once their decision comes out, potentially in the next week, there's going to be a 3-month public consultation window where we as an organisation and you as individuals as well can all have our say on what we like and don't like about that decision. So from our end, we're going to be reviewing that as soon as it comes out, seeing what they're suggesting, and then either going in to support some things or going in to say what we think needs to be improved, and we will be communicating that out with all our supporters as well. So who else can act? It's not just the APVMA. While they're sort of setting that baseline, they're the ones that we really want to take that control at that top level. Others can play a vital role. So territories and state governments can tighten restrictions as well. They can also put in place threatening process nominations. Victorian government did that a couple of years ago and listed second generation anticoagulants as a threatening process in Victoria. And local councils can also do a lot. And there are now well over 50 local councils that have restricted the use of second generation anticoagulants in public spaces and for their contractors to use. So that's been fantastic. And there are ways that we can feed information out to local councils as well. And there are also obviously those that stock the products and those that go and buy the products. So we've been targeting particularly Bunnings as the largest supplier of these products on shelves to take more action. We've been pushing for them to withdraw some of these products from their shelves. They have not yet, and they do identify first generation and second generation products on their website, but it doesn't clarify the risk or the difference between the products, just that they are different. Of course, all of this puts the onus back on the consumer to be able to understand the differences between these products, what all the chemicals are, what they should be avoiding, what they should be going for, how they should be using these products. And that's really hard. These chemicals are all really difficult to understand. They all have very long names. I cannot pronounce most of them. So we need to make that information easier. Our Act for Birds website, which I'm sure Tarquin will share a link for you, has a rodenticide section, a rat poison section for people. And so we're doing our best to get the word out. So we've got pages which are, products to avoid, products that are more preferred, which list all those chemicals like Mike talked about before. We've got brochures that are available for people to print out that target a whole range of different audiences too. There's ones that can be, for example, printed and made available in vet clinics, because we know, of course, that it's dogs and cats are regularly coming into clinics being impacted by rat poison, probably even more so than our wildlife is. So our campaigning is connecting at all these different levels. So going for this national reform, but really supporting local action as well. So what are we actually calling for? So we're wanting sort of safer rodent control to be going on across the country. First and foremost, what we want is these second generation products, those Bs and Ds were the two different types of chemicals for the most part that were the second generation products, removing those from public sale. They're the products that stay in the systems of these animals for weeks and months and cause that secondary poisoning, so moving through the food chain. Like what is already underway in other countries, we are saying that they should be used only by trained and licensed professionals under strict regulatory control. So not just sitting on supermarket shelves in huge numbers for anybody to go in and buy and use how they like. So this step alone would be a huge way forward. Because we're also saying that we need to stop using these outside buildings, and Mike talked about that as well. This is where they cause the most harm, when they're in sheds, when they're in paddocks, along fence lines, when they're sort of just out and about, where native predators or other wildlife can just easily access the bait themselves or find a poisoned rat or mouse. So if these poisons are used, they should be contained indoors in locked bait boxes away from the wider environment. As Mike said, there is a place for these products to be used in conservation efforts. So we would like to see, for example, buffer zones established around sensitive environments, around our bushlands, around nature reserves, where these products generally should not be used unless there is a clear need because it's meeting a conservation goal. And so, for example, on island eradication efforts. Those efforts are really needed to be targeted in an intervention to save endangered species. So that's where, as Mike said, you have those pulses of use and then that's it, rather than the long-term, large-scale use of products just being available anywhere out in the environment. So our goal is really to minimise that widespread uncontrolled use and just use it in those critical conservation efforts where it's well and truly needed. We're also asking for, the promotion of much more safe options. It's really hard to know what to use. Mike showed you some suggestions before. I'll talk about a few things in a minute. But generally, for most people going for, mechanical or electronic traps, there are some of those newer non-anticoagulant baits, like the Rat Sack Naturals that don't build up the food chain, that should be the option that you go to if you need to go to sort of control methods. And we're sort of wanting people to actively promote and preferentially go for these alternatives, so we can help people understand the difference between them. And this is where sort of the concept of integrated pest management comes in. It's a fancy term for basically dealing with the cause of rodent problems, not just the symptoms or the rats that you see. So that's things like blocking entry points, managing food waste, improving sanitation setups. So then the baits are just the last resort. So the national standard is integrated pest management, with the control being the not just being the afterthought. You're actually putting processes in place before you get to the point where you need to be putting poison out. And as Mike said, Australia doesn't actually have a clear picture of how much rodenticide is out there and being used and how much wildlife is harmed. We have a very long list of birds and other animals that we know have been impacted across Australia, but so much of that is sort of ad hoc discoveries, or, people like Mike who are going, I wonder what's going on with this particular species. We need some sort of systematic reporting system to keep track of where the poisons are used, how often they're used, and what the impact is on wildlife. And that's sort of a big reporting system. The UK has that sort of system set up with a predatory bird monitoring scheme. And finally, what we're looking for is something like a threat abatement plan. So this is a long-term coordinated strategy to tackle rodenticides. So it's saying, yes, we remove them from public sale, but we look at what else needs to happen on the ground with scientists, government officials, wildlife groups, pest control industry, all coming together to work towards the one goal of removing these products from the food chains in our wildlife. So on to what you can do in your home to reduce the reliance on having to use poisons around the place. There's lots of things that you can do without sort of having to go to poisons, or with poisons as the last resort. So start by, thinking about where you're storing your food, and storing it securely. So that's particularly the case of things like pet food. And I know anybody that has chickens will probably know that if you've got chickens, you've got rodents around. And so making sure that chook food, birdseed, is in sort of sealed containers as best as you possibly can go a long way to sort of limiting rodent numbers. Removing debris where you may be getting sort of rodent activity, making sure firewood and things are up off the ground. A tidy yard can sometimes be a bit of a problem for bird-friendly gardening, but I think in terms of rodent control, you're going to want to make things a little bit neater, and so we're not giving the rodents as many places to hide in. Of course, sealing holes and gaps in roofs, in walls, in sheds. We know that rodents can get into really tiny spaces, so trying to limit those to stop them getting into the house. And when you need to control rodents, go for the trapping options over the poisons if you can all avoid it. I know snap traps are not pleasant either, and dealing with, dead rodents is not something that anybody really likes, but at least you know that rodent is not poisoned and it's removed from the environment without causing problems. And, monitor the activity. So, as soon as you start to take note of, if you're finding rat droppings and things around the place, so whether you've got a lot of them or a few, and you can act early to get things under control. And then, of course, our gardens and our houses are not isolated. We are, rats don't respect fence boundaries. They are moving all over the neighbourhood. So talk to your neighbours, encourage them to adopt similar practices, so you're not ending up with poisoned rodents on your property because they've come in from your neighbours' places as well. So what else can you do? This is the Act for Birds website that I'm sure Tarquin will pop in somewhere if she hasn't already, that has all the different information on it. have a look at what you've got in your shed or in your cupboard. So remove those products if they have, any of those chemical names in them. They're the second generation products that we want to avoid. So get those out of there and disposed of appropriately, which is probably contacting your local council and seeing if there's a chemical cleanup that you can dispose of them at safely. You can also talk to your local council. So we have a form on the Act for Birds website where you can look up your local council's information and you can send them an email to ask them to remove the use of second generation products from their spaces, and we can send them a lovely kit on how to go about doing that. So talk to your council, talk to your local stores about what products they have and ask them to make the switch. And then talk to your neighbours and your friends. One thing I have noticed since being involved in this campaign for the last, 5 or 6 years is that this is not malicious. People don't know that this is a problem. And once you start talking about it, I think the vast majority of us are willing to change our practices because we love our tawnies, bird of the year. We love our owls. We love our native wildlife. And so I think the vast majority of people will switch if they're aware that this is actually an issue. So we need to spread that word. So share what you've learned with your friends and neighbours. Support BirdLife's campaign through that Act for Birds page, where you can sign various petitions. You can add your name, and we let you know, for example, when the public submissions are available for the APVMA review, and you can get on board and add your voice to that as well. So I'm going to leave it there, and then I might pop Tarquin up as well because I suggest there is probably some questions.
There certainly are a couple of questions. I've just been monitoring everyone's contributions. Thank you, everyone who put your wonderful comments along there. And I will just note that there were quite a few comments about wanting to see the slide again about what products to use and what not to. So
Sure.
As we said, there's information is available here, and I'm sure we can provide that. And also I've been sharing it as a link down there with the people who've asked that. So I guess one of the questions was, I might go to this one. We've got a question about swift parrots. Is there any sense, I think this might go to you, Mike, whether swift parrots may have been affected by these rodenticides?
If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said probably not. But after I'm not willing to rule anything out at this point. I don't know how a swift parrot could logically be exposed, but the fact is there are no studies other than that one on that one individual Carnaby's cockatoo on rodenticide exposure in parrots and cockatoos worldwide. So I can't honestly give a good answer to that. I wouldn't think so, but nobody's checked. And yeah, again, can't rule anything out at this point.
And similar vein to that.
Sorry, Tarquin.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I saw that question popped up and I jumped into, we have a spreadsheet, internal BirdLife document, which has all the different species that we know have been impacted, and Swifties are not on there. But like Mike said, we don't know. It's just that it hasn't been looked at yet. We can't rule it out. I don't want to sort of give weight to it and say they're impacted because we just don't know.
In that vein, Louise has also suggested, could it be that the Carnaby cockatoo has eaten maggots on a dead rat?
Yeah, that's possible. I have talked to a couple of people who've had a number of different black cockatoo species in captivity, and they've actually, when they've had them like in aviaries, obviously, which you get a fair few rodents coming in, they've observed them actually grabbing and eating rats directly. So yeah, the maggots is possible, but apparently even just chowing down on a rat that they grabbed is something that occasionally is within their behavior, at least in captivity. So the other thing too is that I think people underestimate how many species out there will take a vulnerable rodent that is moving around slowly and in the open during the day. They're an easy source of protein and more things than you would
Oh, I think Mike's frozen.
expect.
There we go.
Oh, sorry there.
No, we can hear you now.
But yeah, no, just I think more species will eat a vulnerable rodent out in the open during the day than people would normally expect. It's an easy source of protein, and yeah, even a lot of species that are not that are will grab them if they get the chance, and that's part of what the
Right.
rodenticides do. They slow down toward the end.
Yep. Excellent. So another question is, do these chemicals persist in the environment? Maybe I might give that to Holly, or
Oh,
is it
yeah, go
Mike?
for it.
Yeah, sorry. Just your internet has been on and off. We might give a chance to catch up. Holly, are you able to answer that one?
Oh, I think Mike's probably better
Oh,
answering that one than I am. They store in the liver of wildlife, so it's more that they sit in the carcass. Um, I'm not sure about getting into sort of waterways and things, Mike.
There's a study from a couple years ago in Germany where they started testing sediments and fish in some of the rivers, and they were detecting rodenticides in the liver of the fish and some traces in the sediment
okay.
as well. And they think that's possibly from baiting in the sewers and either baits being washed directly into the water or dead rat carcasses getting washed into the water. So there does seem to be some contamination in waterways, and it's an active field of research right now.
Excellent. So I'm going to go to Kelly's question. So um, the question was, why is it so hard to ban these products here in Australia? And as part of that, what is the government's arguments against an outright ban?
Did you want that one, Holly, or?
Why? We don't know why exactly because we wait for the review to come out. I think from what I've seen from the article that came out today, the indication was they acknowledge that yes, there are widespread impacts on wildlife, which is good to see. There seems to be an indication that they would like to know whether it's the products themselves that are the problem or whether it is how people are using them that is the problem. So are people using them off label or using them according to packet directions? That's pretty impossible to know. And then it may be sort of needing to still control rodents because we do need to control rodents and there are alternatives, but the second generation products are the widespread ones that people use. And so what happens if that is taken away from people, I suspect might be part of that delay. Mike, what do you think?
I may be a little bit less diplomatic. When I met with the chemical review board at the APVMA, I was directly told that one of the issues around this is that APVMA has a cost recovery model, and they are partially funded through the registration of individual products. And every time a product is deregistered, it directly impacts their budget to the tune of about $50,000 a year. And I think it's certainly more than 20. It's a couple dozen different second generation anticoagulant products that are registered. So a couple million a year out of your budget probably would hurt a lot, regardless of the size of your organization. That's kind of my a cynical view on it, but the long and short is that virtually every other developed country in the world has made a similar decision on this, and Australia is really the only one that hasn't. The reasons behind that, I'll leave you to speculate on, but it really is a pretty serious issue that's been recognized worldwide.
Excellent. So look, that's the bulk of the questions. There are a couple of more, though we are at time, and I will just share in a post here that we do have a petition that goes to Bunnings as well, and I will just reshare the link for the other petition we had that actually goes to the Agriculture Minister. But I will hand back over to you, Holly.
Thanks, Tarquin. And just following up from that too, we will send everybody an email in the coming days post this session, this recording will be uploaded to YouTube, so we will share that link for you for anybody who joined late or for people to share on to friends. And in that will include sort of links to Act for Birds pages, different petitions that you can sign and ways you can get involved as well. So all that information will come. I wanted to thank you, Tarquin, for moderating the Q&A for us, and a massive thank you to Dr. Mike Lohr for your amazing insight into rodenticides. I know you have been at this for a very long time, and hopefully we are getting to a point where we're going to have a good outcome. I'm trying to be positive in this space. It feels like the evidence is overwhelming, so I'm holding on to that. But I know that there's still more to do. And so I just want to thank you for coming tonight and sharing all your knowledge with everybody, and for all the amazing hard work that you have been doing to push this issue in Australia for the last decade. It's just extraordinary. Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to everybody about this, and happy to help get the word out. I'm really interested to see how things go in the next couple months when we hopefully get a response from the APVMA. And yeah, hopefully we, regardless of the outcome, are able to respond accordingly. And if it means keeping the pressure up on this to help protect Australia's native birds, then hopefully we're all prepared to do that and write in with our thoughts and tell people what we want to see out of the government.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Mike. We will be continuing to push this issue at BirdLife as well. Thank you for your talk tonight, and thank you for your support. Thank you, everybody, for coming along tonight. I know it was not a particularly pleasant topic, especially during Bird Week when, we want to be celebrating the joy of birds by doing things like the Aussie bird count. There we go. I've got that there. So go out and do a bird count, maybe see a tawny or two tonight. But keep all this information fresh in your mind, and there will be more actions to come. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for another Birds Meet webinar in the near future. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.